transfer the text over our driver's license, just the front. So they're going to move it. She asked that it would be living pets in income. Should they just get a bunch of work for it? So they just put new flooring in, the appliances, seal the driveway, seal the deck. Duplex.
Mhm.
Just hard to tell what it is.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I gotta do this poll real quick. I need that.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry. No, Ben didn't create this poll for her. This is why the Ben's she sent this stuff out to him and he did update it. Have you ever been part of a discussion on generational diversity? Multiple choice, answer 1, yes, answer 2, no. Which generation were you born into? Multiple choice. Are you okay? Let's see. Silent, boomers, Gen X. Millennials. Missed an opportunity to range.
All right, I see we have a few people in here already. I'd like to give us just a few more minutes to let people log on. I know it's the end of the day and stuff runs over in virtual meetings. So if you're good to just hang out for a couple minutes, we did launch a quick poll, if you guys don't mind taking that, and then we'll get started in about 3 or 4 minutes here. Okay, well, I think people will just continue to join as they can, but I want to make sure that we use the time we have wisely. So I would love to get started. So Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this discussion today. My name is Chelsea Akers. I am the co-founder and COO of Level D&I Solutions, and I'm also your host for the Gray Spaces talk show airing this spring. Our focus on this show is to talk about tough and contentious topics that often come up in discussions around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And although we are specifically focusing on generational diversity today, I think it would be irresponsible of me not to acknowledge the recent and tragic murder of Dante Wright, who was killed after a traffic stop by Brooklyn Center Police in Minnesota. So amid these kind of terrible reminders of the pervasiveness and danger of systemic racism and the continuing demands for social justice, it is more important than ever for us to continue to have these critical conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. So thank you all again for joining and being a part of this discussion. So before we get started, I want to share a little bit about what is to come. So today, like I said, we're discussing generational diversity. I have 3 awesome guests who will introduce themselves in just a minute. And then next month in May, my guest and I will be discussing feminism, the patriarchy and intersectionality, and specifically we'll kind of explore all of the failures and successes of the feminist movement, as well as possible future impacts. I'm also going to put a link to an email form in the chat. So if you want to stay up to date on this show or any of the other TechLife live shows that are going on this month and next, you can sign up there. Okay. All right, on to today. So we have 3 awesome guests joining us on Gray Spaces today to discuss generational diversity, ageism, and how we can kind of come together. So first, I would like to introduce Tonia Morris. Oh, you're on mute.
Woo, technology, right? Okay, hi, my name is Tonia, and I am the owner and founder of Simply HR. We are a multi-generation consultant and training firm, and we focus on providing solution and resources for a multi-generation workplace, and that includes D&I training, professional development training, HR solution, policies that impact your workforce. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. And Kay Coughlin, could you go ahead and introduce yourself as well?
Hey, everybody. I'm so excited to be here with Tonia and Amanda and Chelsea. My name is Kay Coughlin, and my company is Facilitator on Fire. We are generational specialists, but more on a one-on-one or team environment. So what that might look like at work is we might come in and do a leadership seminar or some coaching for leaders and team members, particularly when you're struggling around generations. And what that looks like for families is I do specialize in working with family caregivers. And that's more the one-on-one work and helping them to really improve their own lives, knowing that they're probably in between generations and they have to figure out a way to share those resources. So it's exactly what goes on at work, just more intense because it's family dynamics.
Okay, awesome. And then Amanda St. John, could you go ahead and introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, hi everyone. Echo previous sentiments, really excited to be here today and to discuss this topic. So my career, I'm more focused on organizational effectiveness and change management. I'm a consultant at Slalom. My interest in generational diversity came to fruition in graduate school. So from 2019 to 2020, I was wrapping up my master's at Northwestern University in Chicago and did my own research on generational differences in work values. So I'll share a little bit about that today, but looking forward to learning from everyone on this call today.
Okay, awesome. And I will go ahead and paste all of their LinkedIns in the chat as well in case anyone here wants to connect directly. And as we start this conversation, if you have questions, please feel free to just drop those in the chat to everyone because we'll move into a Q&A session for the last 10 minutes or so of the discussion. And also for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to follow the Pew Research Center's definition of generations. So these are never hard and fast numbers, but essentially that they define those. So the silent generation are those born between 1920 and 1945. Boomers were born between 1946 and 1964. Generation X is those born 1965 to 1980. Millennials, or Gen Y, are those born between 1981 and 1996. And then Gen Z is that group born between 1997 and 2012. And again, these numbers are not definite. As Kay likes to say, it's an art and a science. So many people who fall right at the end or beginning of a generation maybe don't identify with the one that they're technically born into. And those are often called cuspers. So we see you, we recognize that you're here as well. But just to give everyone an idea of how we're defining these groups, I think it's good to have a reference point. So to start, Tonia, I would love for you to kind of open our discussion by sharing some of the barriers that organizations are often facing with a multi-general workforce. And that can be in general and COVID specific, since that's kind of a new set of challenges.
And I was going to say that because, you know, we have a workforce that has really been reimagined. 2020, we all been exposed to different things. But prior to that, I would say that there's a couple of things that I have been privy to and work with a lot of organizations. I've been doing this stuff for over a decade. And there's a couple of things, you know, there's that communication barriers, and I'm going to talk about that. There's that work expectations, you know, and then there's another piece that I think that the motivation piece of it. So let me just talk about the communication barriers. We all know communication has been expanded. You know, I'm a Gen Xer, and so we were one of the first generation that used, you know, we were in the middle of that technology. So we use our form of communication as email. Other generations, such as maybe your baby boomers, and again, these are preferred. These are not absolute, because we all using technology now, but it's been expanded. When you think about the baby boomers, you know, when we're at work, they'll pick up the phone in a heartbeat and give you a call. And the silent generation, they want to see you face to face, that interaction. And as we get into the millennials and the Gen Z, we start seeing technology being evolved a little bit. And so I always say that people always say there's some barriers. I think we can communicate. We just got to know how to. It's so many mediums, and we have to know how to use them and what is preference to one another. And that's where the breakdown comes, because we typically communicate based on our preference. So I would say communication has been the biggest barrier. Not that we can't do it, we just have to embrace the differences, right? Also, with the general communication is frequency. You know, in some generation, no news is what? Good news, right? And so you have other generations like, I want to know how I'm doing, right? And I want frequent coaching and frequent feedback. So we have to be mindful of how we show up when we're communicating and what vehicles we are using. That's number one. The second challenge I think that you see in the multi-generation workplace is the workplace expectations have changed. I say all the time that the employer and employee relationship has evolved, okay? And so where I was taught, I'm again a Gen X, I was taught to go to school and get a job and go stay on a job forever. Well, the younger generation, they want purpose. It has to line up. We try to just fit it in there. And for other generation, if it don't fit, they leave, right? And so when you start thinking about loyalty and all of that, it has just been defined, right? And so I think once we understand that the communication is different, right? Communication expectation, and then the work expectation is different too. And what motivates you may not motivate me. And we have to make sure as employers that we understand that it should not be a one size shoe fit all. That's when we start having problems with retention, because we put everybody in these different, well, in the same bucket, so we don't include. So I love the fact that we are talking about generational inclusiveness. And I think it's very important that we understand that the workforce has changed from a communication style, from a work expectation style. Like, for example, the younger generation, they like work-life integration. Well, for a Gen X, we were one of the first generation talked about, you know, work-life balance. You know, we want to see our children and go spend some time with them, you know, afternoon events or what have you. So it has evolved. Now, when you start talking about COVID has really taught all of us that we need to be what I call software companies. because we had to use all the different platforms to communicate. And I do think when we start talking about generation inclusion, there's a lot of exclusion took place in COVID. There's a lot of generations that were isolated, right? And so therefore it took on a whole nother meaning now. I'm working with a lot of organizations that to wrap technology around DE&I. I don't like to call it DE&I, IDE. Inclusion, diversity, and equity, because I think it's important now that we understand that our world is global, but the most important thing that we have to be inclusive. So that's what I would say as far as some of the challenge. There's much more, but when you start breaking down why people leave, it's that sense of not belonging is a big piece too. But if we learn how to communicate and learn how to engage and also meet the needs of all the different generations, I think we can start seeing more of a belongingness in the workplace.
Great. Kay or Amanda, do you guys have anything to add on that point? No, Tonia killed it. Awesome. Okay.
Okay. All righty.
Great.
This is my sweet spot. I really love working with organizations and try to make sure they understand the dynamics and why it's important.
Yeah, that's really great. Okay, awesome. Well, let's maybe start to think about some of the stereotypes and biases that many of us have around different generations, and some of that can be communication based. So Kay, can you kind of dive into some of the more common, again, biases, stereotypes that each generation faces, and kind of talk about, why these are harmful and how we can maybe start to move past those perceived differences?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I think we first have to start with what is a stereotype and what is a bias, just so that we're sharing definitions. Now, I want you to know that these did not come from any dictionary. These are functional definitions that I use when I work with groups, so that we are all starting from the same place. So if we look at a stereotype, that's going to be a set of beliefs that are commonly accepted. That also often makes them a counterfeit for things that are true. So you have to be really careful with a stereotype. It can be easy to just slide into letting that be your truth when it indeed is not true. A bias then is going to be a belief that a person or a group chooses, more like a single belief. One group is more important than another. Boy, are we seeing that right now. One person is more important than another. I have a bias for my children. I think they're the best teenagers in the world most of the time. And so biases and stereotypes, these are natural, these are normal, these are human characteristics. It's about human behavior. What we need to understand about stereotypes and biases is that our brains evolved these as a construct back when we were hunters and gatherers, because we needed to be able to react quickly, because it was a matter of physical safety. So it's a shortcut. Our brains like shortcuts because it saves calories. Okay, so if you can move faster and if you can save calories, you have a better chance of surviving. The trouble is that doesn't serve us very well in a lot of situations today. I'm not going to get into the racial violence, but when you think about someone drawing a gun out of habit, right, that's a stereotype and a behavioral bias that comes into play. So neither stereotypes nor biases by themselves are dangerous. They actually are neutral. It's when we act on them that the danger comes into play. And unfortunately, you can't know if someone has a bias unless they tell you, or unless they behave in such a way that they actually are expressing that bias. So that's what you want to look for. When it comes to generations, the problem is that we don't know what we don't know. I don't know what Tonia believes about Gen Z. I don't know what Amanda believes about boomers. I don't know what Chelsea believes about me as a Gen Xer unless we actually have that discussion. So what we need to do is create an atmosphere where we can ask those questions. And often the place to start is by figuring out what your pain points are. Okay, so I'm not really going to talk about what the stereotypes of each generation is, But I would like to talk just a minute about the specific areas that you can look in your workplace to say, do we have a generational issue here? So these are just a few of the places that you would start. There are others, but okay. So if you want to make a case statement to say, like to say to your boss, I want to bring Tonia in to talk to us because I think we have a problem in this area. Here's where you would look. The first one on my list is legal problems. Lots of laws out there, and they vary by state about ages. Okay, it's discrimination issue. Do you have expenses? Is there a budget issue that you continue to have because of an older workforce or a younger workforce? And what does that look like in terms of the biases when you are setting up your budgets? Data retention is a big one. Look at Tonia nodding her head. When generations can't communicate about which databases to use, which modules in those databases to use, how long to retain that information, your data integrity is going to suffer, and your institutional knowledge is going to suffer. That is a big cost center related to generations. Do not miss that one. Another one's going to be morale, talent attraction, talent retention. If you have a workplace that isn't friendly to someone of a certain age or an age group, you are missing an opportunity because people of different ages, here's another one, they represent your customer base. So do I have people on my workforce who represent my customer base? That's a big opportunity you can miss. Are we doing something with generations that is not in alignment with our values, especially with values that are public facing, right? But that can also go back to talent, because if you have a generational problem that is expressly against your values, that's going to inhibit the kind of talent that you'll be able to bring in. So you might have opportunity costs related to innovation. If you are missing people of any generation, and I'm not kidding you, from the youngest to the oldest generations, you're going to be missing opportunity to innovate because each age group has a unique way they interact with technology. And I'm talking, technology, really all that means is the way we use tools, right? So if you're talking about an older generation, they are going to have a deep knowledge bed about how to communicate on the telephone. That's something that my generation, Generation X, also has a deep knowledge about. It's actually incredibly important if you want to be training up a younger generation to say, take customer service calls, right? So that's a technology. But also if you have an older customer base, you're going to want to make sure that you have your tech folks are representing your customers with any technology they will be interfacing in, right? So there's an opportunity cost there. I would say that's an opportunity cost around innovation, but also research and development. So if you haven't thought about how are we using generations as a business tool to have a business that is strong and stable and flexible and agile and can bend with the times and reinvent itself, say during, a pandemic, then there's a big opportunity cost to missing out on those generations. Chelsea, what else do you want me to cover?
No, I think that all sounds great. Tonia or Amanda, do you guys have thoughts or, something you guys want to bounce back and forth?
I do. I think Kay nailed it, because I think that when we start thinking about any form of diversity, and specifically with the generation, I love G&I. I call it G&I. I love it because there's so many cost opportunities. And, it used to be a time where you saw in the workplace, it was chaos, each generation against each other. And I think what you just laid out, Kay, about the opportunity, and I look at it about leveraging each generation. If we can leverage each generation, we can have the innovation and the creativity. We need that now because things are moving with technology. And we saw how COVID threw us into something that some were not really prepared for. But I think when you frame it the way you did, Kay, about the fact that it's a benefit, it's opportunity cost as well, I believe that we now could assign, or not necessarily assign, align, if you will, G&I with the business model.
Yeah, and I think the only point I'll add on to echo the thoughts is we're all likely part of a multi-generational workforce and a multi-generational team. So how can we leverage each other's preferences and strengths to become that better whole? And I feel like a lot of times when we look across differences, and as you mentioned, it doesn't have to be just within the generational space, but with differences among others, we really highlight, oh, these are the differences, but not so much of, hey, these are the strengths we can play off of each other and make up a better whole.
When you take a look at the poll, if you've already filled that out, or even if you haven't filled it out, there's a question on there that says, is there a stereotype about your generation that you think doesn't describe you or that you don't relate to? You know, this is something that as a Gen Xer, I mean, for heaven's sake, the longest time, the stereotype about Gen Xers is that we were slackers, right? And that we were very self-absorbed. And I really think that came about because nobody was paying attention to what we were doing because we were left on our own. I have never identified with that. And when I tell my 2 teenagers about that, they crack up because they say that they've never met anybody who more so than me is capable and less of a slacker. And then they say that about my friends as well. So when you look at the generations around you and you think, well, I don't even know what I could be misreading about them. Look at your own generation first and try and think about, what do people misread about my generation? And if there's even just one thing, that's going to give you some idea of how much we really tend to misclassify people in generations. Oh, and it's very important to remember, there never has been a person born who is a perfect representative of any stereotype, whether it's skin color or age or gender, right? Everybody's very different. So looking at someone and expecting them to fulfill all of the hopes and dreams or negative aspects of any stereotype is not looking at them as a person. It's looking at them as a group. And there is no single person that is a group all on their own. And the opportunity there is to look at someone and find out who they are and maybe ask them, you know, what's a stereotype about your generation that you don't identify with? That is a great way to open a conversation.
Oh, that's a great idea and good actionable advice too.
I want to say something. I know Kay said something about, you know, you don't hear a lot about the Gen X, which I identify as a Gen X, right? And I say this all the time, we are passed over and we're ticked off. How about that? That's what it is. And so we don't hear a whole lot about us, but we're here and we have something to say, right?
No, that's great. And I'm sure if everyone in this discussion thought a little bit about, you know, one stereotype that, you know, really irks them, I'm sure we could each come up with one. So, okay, perfect. So we talked a little bit about biases and stereotypes, and these types of kind of innate reactions that we're wired for can sometimes be difficult to overcome, especially if they're introduced early in our lives, or it's just kind of this built-in thing that we do for survival. So that can be difficult, but the research actually shows that generations are more alike than different in a lot of ways, and especially when it comes to our workplace values and motivations. So Amanda, could you share a little bit more about your research and data in this space and what you've found?
Yeah, thanks, Chelsea. So as you mentioned, I'll be talking about my research that I did over the course of 2019 and 2020 for my master's program at Northwestern. So just saying, this is one study that I did. It does not encompass all the studies. There's a lot out there, but I'm always happy to dive into more detail on what I learned specifically. So what I really was looking to understand is, are there work value differences across generations? And this topic, I'll tell you a little bit about why it was of interest to me, is a lot of us, as Kay and Tonia have talked about, apply generational stereotypes to one another. And a lot of times this happens unconsciously. So I've experienced this myself. I remember, you know, a couple of years ago, someone said, well, if you cut your hair, you would look a lot older at work and you'd probably be more successful. And I was like,
Wow.
interesting, you know, so just comments like that. And I was like, I really want to understand what people think about these generational differences. And additionally, as Kay touched on, it makes it harder to work and be productive on multi-generational teams and in a multi-generational workforce when we're going off these assumed assumptions and stereotypes. So not only is it a kind of lose-lose situation for the team members and the employees, but also for the organization in terms of that productive value. So a little bit of background about generations, and mine are slightly different than the Pew research that Chelsea mentioned earlier, just by a year or two. Again, they're kind of the art and the science, but really generations differ in more than just the year they were born. So something that I found in my research and through other research articles is generations have distinct differences in their experiences growing up. So it's not just the year they were born, but how they grew up, what events did they undergo, and really this is thought to have influenced a person's individual attitudes and values. So for example, a little bit about research that's not mine. Researchers have at times identified and studied different work values over several years and found some overarching themes. So for example, various studies have found that Gen Y and Gen X to a lesser extent value leisure, freedom, and work-life balance more in comparison to their boomer counterparts. They've also, some of the themes and overarching studies have found that Gen Y and Gen X have a greater drive for achievement than other generations. So a little bit about what other research studies have shown over the course of years. What I specifically found were a couple things that I wanted to share with the group today. So I first took a look at, do generations value something different at work? And I did find that each generation values a different work value the most. So what I mean by that is there were 24 different work values that I was researching, and in looking at the survey data, each value or each generation said, this is my #1 top priority work value. So for boomers, this was information. So having access to information you need to do your job is what they ranked as most valuable. Gen X was around benefits. So having benefits, for example, vacation pay, health and dental insurance, pension plan to meet your personal needs. And then Gen Y, their most valuable work value was working in an environment or balance. So working in an environment that allows you to balance your life and your private life and your family responsibilities. So thought that was really interesting that each generation put an emphasis on a different work value. I also took a look at, is there a relationship between age and work values? So as we move through our career and as we get older, do we value different work values than others? And so I did find a relationship between age and then 8 different work values. So these were among feedback, coworkers, continuously learning, hours we work or that balance, interesting work, freedom, and advancement. So these relationships, or excuse me, these work values are more valuable the younger we are in our career.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, as age increases, the value placed on these work values decreases. Interestingly enough, the strongest relationship was between age and advancement, meaning as people get older, they value advancement less than individuals of a younger age or generation. So kind of putting that, my common sense and hat on, that kind of makes sense as someone who perhaps is coming right out of the gate, their career, they may be more aggressive or value that advancement as they start out versus when you move up the ladder, there may not be much room for advancement, right? So there was 8 work values that had that relationship, but as Chelsea mentioned, we have a lot more in common than we think. So 17 of those did not have that relationship, meaning that different generations really kind of put the same emphasis on that value, regardless of where they were in their age, in their career. Another finding that I found really interesting was that the majority of all generations perceived differences aimed at Gen Y. So I was talking more so about my quantitative research before, and this next question I asked was qualitative. So I asked people, what generational differences in values do you see at work? Really what I did was code people's responses. And just some fun tidbits, at least I think they're fun. So approximately 2/3 of boomers and Gen X participants believe there to be differences aimed at the younger generation. So for example, people would say younger generations are more entitled than older generations. Gen Y, so millennials, also view differences between themselves and their older counterparts, but not to the extent of the boomers and Gen X. Another piece that I think is interesting is approximately a quarter of participants who fell in the boomer Gen X category perceived no generational differences in values. So they were saying, no, I don't see any differences based on our generation, or I see differences that are more focused on life stage or life experience versus a generation. And about 15% of Gen Y also perceived no generational differences. The last point I'll kind of hit on is, I know that's a lot to digest, but really kind of the headline of my research was, there are generational differences in work values. Each generation values something a little differently than the counterpart cohorts, but individuals are different, and overgeneralizing or stereotyping has proved to negatively impact team effectiveness, productivity, and morale. So we don't want to ignore our generational differences, because that'll negatively impact how we work together. But it's important to find the right balance of how do we recognize and have empathy for others' differences in the generations while we're working productively with them. Questions or thoughts?
That was great.
It's a lot to chew on, so I'm definitely.
I think you answer a lot of the questions. I do this training on how to minimize and stop chaos in the workplace. And I really believe the data that you just gave to us really help us to have a clear understanding about the differences, especially in the levels. And, like, for example, if I was in the workplace, I would care less about a career. I'll be trying to slow it down as opposed to trying to be aggressive like I was before. And I think it's great to communicate the differences, and I think we don't do enough of that. I think Kay said something earlier about, how do you start those conversations? I think you're going to get into that, Chelsea, so I won't get into the tools yet, but I think it's very important that we know that data and we talk about it.
Yeah.
And embrace some of it,
I also think that there's something that we tend to gloss over, which is we don't know how much of this precisely is related to your generation and how much of it is related to your stage of life.
Yes.
Or your age. So it could be that Gen Xers are more interested in benefits right now because we are a sandwich generation and we have so many resources that we need to be keeping an eye on, that I need to know that my benefits are settled so that I don't have to worry about something for my kids or for my parents. And I am a family caregiver, so I know that I know that discussion intimately. But when you're looking at the people around you, what kind of assumptions are you making because you think that it applies to their generation versus to their age, and is it true for that specific person? It's particularly important when you're talking about teamwork, team members who work together every day, or maybe who see each other once in a while, trying not to over apply those stereotypes, as Amanda mentioned.
I also think assumptions play into this as well too. And that's why we have to encourage and understand the different communications among the generations so we can have that dialogue, so we can be engaged and know, because otherwise I have seen many teams operate on assumptions.
Yeah. And it's easy to do, right?
It is.
Yeah, it seems like that's kind of what we're wired for, but what's the old adage? And assuming makes a ass out of you and me.
And it does all day long.
And it's a false foundation. If you are building a company or a team on assumptions, get some help right now, because that is building a company on quicksand. Assumptions they're attractive because they look like the real thing. I do call them counterfeits. That is a counterfeit for the truth. And if you want an organization or a product that's going to stand the test of time, you have to build it on things that are real and not some kind of counterfeit truths like, you know, age is a big one, generations is a big one. Making those assumptions is dangerous to your bottom line.
Well, I also say we have no choice. It's necessary, it's mandatory, because the workforce has been reimagined, and the employees you had in January of 2020 are not the same employees you have today. And so that's why it's so important to embrace can't even say the word, inclusivity in your workplace, because it's going to make everything better from a bottom line and for an employee experience. Employees want experiences now. That's what they want. We had, what, 2.5 million women leave the workforce last year? Are you kidding me? And then we got the gig economy that we have to compete with. And when I say gig, you got a lot of the young adults are coming out of the workplace, they're gigging, they're doing freelance work. And so that's what organizations are competing with. So why not develop or create an inclusive workplace where everyone feel like they can belong? And so I think we have to think about that as well.
Well, and this goes back to the talent question, I think. You know, if you think about the Gen Z, or iGen is the other name for them, being the youngest generation, they for sure are going to be in your internship programs now, because there's a large chunk of them that are right now in undergraduate programs. We started seeing them enter the workforce 2 years ago. And if they are now going out into this gig economy, you have a highly untrained, inexperienced workforce, no fault of their own, they're young adults. That could be a huge opportunity. If you want to attract someone who's going to work for you for 5 or 10 or 20 years, and you know that they're 22, 23 right now, there's a generational opportunity to create a training program to make that attractive so that they will learn the skills that you want them to have,
right,
instead of learning crummy skills on their own because nobody is training them. And then they will become the leaders and the lead salespeople of tomorrow.
Great. I think those are all awesome points. I'd love to see kind of what each of you have as like a call to action, as like, you know, something that the audience viewers here can kind of take with them to really like put something in motion around this. So I don't know if somebody wants to go first, but I would just love to hear what you guys think on that.
I'll jump in, and I like to leave a call to action for everyone on this call to employ to care about their employees. So you may be saying, Tonia, what in the world is that? Well, I use it as a care model. And I think we need to communicate more often and use different types of medium. That's the C. We need to appreciate our employees in different ways. There's no one size shoe fit all. And then we have to respect the differences. Okay, respect the differences and then engage everyone. If we could just do something as simply as care, then we would see that we can start bringing back a workforce, or really attracting a workforce that everybody cares about one another. And I love to just leave that with each and every one of you, the care model.
That's great. Amanda?
Yeah, I would encourage folks to just kind of activate that awareness. So while it may sound easy, I was actually earlier today working on an unconscious bias training. And what you do is part of that exercise is we flash pictures up of different people that you may have a stereotype around. And you see that your brain goes there without you even thinking about it. So as you work in your multi-generational workforce or with your team, if you find yourself kind of getting there initially, try to backtrack and say, how did I get here? Or what is the assumption that I'm operating under? That I find is really helpful, just to kind of train our brain a little bit around what are these assumptions or stereotypes that we're automatically going to, and kind of fixing or rerouting our brain. The first step is that awareness piece. So I think that's a really big one. If you're a leader or a people leader of your workforce and you have a multi-generational team, I think finding the balance of, hey, how can we structure ourselves in a way that brings out the strengths and the preferences of everyone? So for example, if I have an individual, and this could be different not even related to generations, but just understanding that, hey, kind of from the data, we know that Gen Y values this freedom and balance more. How could I set them up for success in something that they really value versus maybe another work value, and just having that open conversation, but making sure to individualize that plan based on the person while taking in some of their preferences.
All right, awesome. All right, Kay, what are your thoughts?
Well, so I think this theme of awareness obviously is, we are all in agreement on the awareness. And so what I'm going to say to you is don't hide from it. If you think you have a generational issue, you probably do, for sure. One of the unique things that I have found in the world of, in Tonia's term IDE, inclusion, diversity, and see, I can't even remember what the E is when I don't put it in the middle. And equity, sorry, is that age and generations tends to be less loaded than many of the other issues around diversity that we think about: skin color, race, gender. Those can be really loaded and exceptionally painful for probably a large number, or a larger number of people than you would think at your workplace. Age, for the most part, now I'm generalizing here, it tends to be less loaded, which also makes it an opportunity to help everyone learn about all kinds of diversity. What we know about diversity training is that when you learn about diversity in any area, you are actually helping open up brains and minds to diversity discussions in all areas. And so if you can start with something that tends to be less painful, not always, but tends to be, like age and generation, if you have a workplace that is particularly resistant to talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, you might start with generations, because it's a great sort of a soft starting place that just seems to be more comfortable for people. So look at it as an opportunity to really start a much bigger conversation.
Yes. Yes, I agree.
Okay, perfect. This is all great information. I'm taking notes as we're talking here. So really quickly, we're going to move into Q&A soon, but we're going to launch just a closing Zoom poll just to better understand your experience with joining this discussion, and just making sure that we're meeting all the needs and anticipation of the audience members here. So it should only take about a minute if you could answer that when it pops up. And
You know
then
what, Chelsea, we were supposed to leave one other takeaway and we didn't do it. Can I read it here?
Right. Yeah,
and it was probably one that I offered up. And this one is, please ask, is there someone at your organization who is keeping an eye specifically on generations and the way ages interact with one another? If there's not, that's an opportunity for you. And if there is, go to that person and ask, how can we leverage this? How can we ask some of these questions? We learned some great stuff. How can we get a hold of Amanda's research from her? How can we talk to Tonia? So go to that person who is already doing it. And if that person doesn't exist, that's a real chance for you to maybe make something happen for your company.
yeah, that's great. And I would guess that person would often be maybe HR, or if someone has a specific diversity title. Yeah, but
it can be individual too. Sometimes you could do the grassroots approach as well too, you know.
And I don't think there's any guarantee. I find this question about generations, when people call me, one of the things they tend to say is, you know, we just kind of never get around to this. We're not really educated in this, and it's become a problem because we kind of weren't paying attention. And that's going to start coming up a lot more as the Gen Z, iGen now enters the workforce. We see this question about generations come up periodically when there is a transition in the workplace.
Yes.
And that's the transition happening right now, is the Gen Z, iGen. So if you're not on top of it now, you're going to find yourself, you know, being in front of the 8 ball rather than behind it. So now is the time to get ahead of it before it starts to get away from you.
You know, and I also find when I'm doing DE&I work, employers think it's a diversity, equity, and inclusion issue. And when I go in there and do assessment, it's all about generations inclusion. And like you said, it starts from there, and you can get a lot of buy-in that way. So I encourage those who do not have an DE&I strategy, you may want to look at a G&I strategy.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice to your point and to Kay's point around it can sometimes be a softer topic to kind of lead in with, and then hopefully it's, you know, kind of a gateway to having some more of the more painful but also critical conversations around inclusion, diversity, and equity. So I've seen a kind of question come through the chat. Please feel free to put your questions in here if you haven't already. So the question that came through was, do you feel that generational discrimination impacts certain generations more than others in today's virtual work environment? And I think we talked about this a little bit with communication and COVID, but Tonia, I see you nodding your head if you want to.
Yeah, coming from the HR background and then coupled with DE&I have seen so many different cases. We've been called in to talk about those who feel, you know, I'm not going to put a generation out there, but there's some that may not be privileged to all this technology. They don't even want it. And now we're thrust into this, and now they're feeling isolated and they're not producing. And so therefore they're being out, if you will, or feel like they're being treated differently. So we have seen an uptick on that. And I'm not just going to say just older, just those who may not want to use all of the technology that we had to use in 2020 and don't feel like they've been, you know, the word is belonging. That's the big piece. They didn't feel like they felt like they've been treated differently, but it's really is how we were interacting with our employees in 2020. No one knew we were going to be doing this for a year almost, right? And so I have seen an uptick. And so therefore we had to go in there and teach leaders how to be an inclusive leader in the COVID space, right? How to engage your employees in making sure they have the tools they need. So I have seen that happen.
Okay, great. Any other thoughts on that?
Well, one question I have, and maybe Amanda could speak a little more to this, I think it depends on whether you're talking about legal discrimination or what I would call personal or emotional discrimination, where there's maybe nothing illegal going on, but you feel it, you know, in your gut that you're being discriminated against. So so that's going to make a difference. Amanda, did you find anything in your data about perceived discrimination?
Can I say something?
We can cover that.
Can I say something before, Amanda? You're right, Kay. When we did the investigation, we found it was the feelings, but we had to go through the process too, because they're saying it's discrimination, but when we had to break it down, it was the feeling of COVID and anxiety and all those different things. So we went through the process.
Yeah. In terms of discriminations, it was, we really asked around what work values do you perceive, or what differences in work values do you perceive? And so I would say this was pre-COVID, so not in the virtual workforce, but you know, about a quarter of participants that were Gen X and 25% that were Gen or boomers, they perceived differences mainly at the Gen Y millennial value. And so I would say that the research that I did targeted that people viewed the differences towards the younger generation. What I mean by that and what the data was categorized as, because it was qualitative data, was, let me just pull up some sample quotes here. For example, you know, the younger generations like the flexibility to work from home and are more flexible with their work values. The younger generations seem more self-absorbed. The younger generations seem more entitled. So those were kind of the things that were flagged as differences toward Gen Y. So that was the majority.
You know, not on me. Okay.
Oh, sorry. I have a kind of question related to that and around like kind of the perceived bias or discrimination. And I know, Amanda, you kind of shared one personal story around that. I would love to hear if each of you kind of has advice on how you've handled that individually in the past, if you feel like you've, you know, maybe again, not legally been discriminated against, but maybe had some suggestions or comments made that felt like some sort of discrimination because of your age. How did you handle that kind of in a work environment?
Well, I mean, I can tell you for sure that it's one of the reasons that I got into doing what I do now. You know, I was in the workforce for almost 20 years before I went out full time on my own. And a large part of that had to do with different kinds of assumptions and discrimination that were happening in my workplaces, including age and of course, gender, being a female. And I see the next question that we've got coming up here is, do these issues tend to course correct? And I think these will play nicely together when we talk about that.
I can say I have not witnessed that. However, spending 25 plus years in human resources, I have witnessed others doing it. And so you hear these, especially in the recruiting aspect, you know, I used to have my team, some of the things they used to say, and it just irked me. And that was the reason why I came out of the workforce, to be a catalyst for change for the workplace, because I knew that we're going to be having multiple generations in the workplace. And since I was front end and we're doing onboarding, doing the recruiting, I saw it firsthand play out. And so I wanted to be able to teach organizations how not to do this here. But I will say that, I think out of all the discrimination, or I should say out of all of the diversity, generational seems to be the most acceptable one to talk about. And unconsciously, like, for example, it's not unheard to hear somebody say that millennials are, you know, entitled, or the baby boomers are old. You could never go and say a Black person is this or that, or a gay person is this right here, without you thinking you're going to get, you know, in trouble. And so I think we have to re-educate that it does fall in the same, you know, bucket as well. We have to be respectful of that as well. So that's the thing I think. But to answer that question, I do think until you have organizations to invest in training on what, you know, this is all about, what diversity is in all the different forms, then we can see it moving to a place where we don't have to address it anymore. But so many people don't address it. They just come in and say what they want to say and think it's okay, and it's not okay, especially when around the generational piece. I see that done all the time.
Okay, awesome. Amanda, anything to add on that, on just like personal experiences around how to handle maybe feeling like you're the subject of some kind of maybe generational discrimination?
Yeah, so I mentioned the haircut comment earlier, and I get comments all the time that I look like a baby or really young. And I know people don't mean it in a mean-hearted way, but it's still offensive. So I'd say earlier in my career, I'm not proud of, I just kind of let it go. And I was like, I'm going to prove myself. And, you know, I guess I was like you said, kind of acceptable, right? Like I'll brush it off. It's not necessarily about my gender or my race, and so I'll deal with it. But lately I've been starting to have those conversations with folks, and I won't call them out in a meeting, but I'll say, hey, especially in this world, hey, ping you, do you have 5 minutes to catch up? And I'll just say, hey, I know your intentions were probably good, but just to let you know, this really kind of offended me and rubbed me the wrong way. And, you know, usually every time I have that conversation, it goes fine and they're very sorry. And it's just not something they think about. So I would say that prior, I used to just kind of brush it off and prove myself, but I have found a lot of personal reward in having that conversation with folks. And once I have the conversations with folks in that respectful manner, I've never had it happen again, or someone tell me that that's not a valid concern. So if something does have you feeling that way, my recommendation would be to reach out to the person, obviously having that respectful conversation, not coming at them of like, why would you say this? And, you know, something that would get someone in defense mode has worked really well for me.
Okay, great. And then Kay kind of pointed to it, but we had another question pop into the chat that I think is a good one to kind of have our final question here. So the question is, I'm curious if generational inclusion issues tend to course correct naturally as new generations grow into leadership roles in the workforce. Kay's shaking her head no. Do you want to kind of talk on that a little bit?
All I have to say is, inertia is a way stronger than you think it is, because we are dealing with interpersonal dynamics. A problem that you have is never going to correct itself unless you are very intentional about creating a framework for it to be corrected. I think that has been proven out in all kinds of studies across all kinds of disciplines. A problem that you don't deal with simply continues on into the future. Tonia, what about you and your work? What have you found?
I agree with you on wholeheartedly on that. And I just think that, especially as we grow into leadership, we got to invest. We got to invest in training, making sure our people are equipped. And we got to be okay that things have shifted. We don't lead the same. We don't even communicate the same. And we have to be able to embrace that. So I do think that it's not going to be automatic. It's just going to something we all going to have to work at it and be intentional about it.
Yeah, I think what you'll see, and just doing some research on this, is, you know, the inclusion issues don't tend to fix themselves, they shift the weight. So as you have a generation kind of come out of the workforce and a new one come in, you'll see where is that majority or kind of the peak fall at. And then that creates some new potential issues just because the shift of the population.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so we are right at time here. I want to thank everyone for the great questions and for letting me, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Can we, I like this last question, where remote work paradigms improve generation inclusion or hurt it? That's key, because this is the world that we are in. And I think if we don't equip our leaders in this remote world, how we work, it could hurt it, because all the interfacing, the personal relation, you know, that does hurt. However, we are global, we are technology. So it's just going to be depend on the workforce in which we are working in and how they embrace and engage one another. So I thought that was a great question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for catching that. Yes, so thank you all again for joining this, for posting some great questions in here and letting me really highlight these three amazing women in this space while trying to also tackle some really tough topics. So I hope to see you all again next month when we're talking more about feminism and kind of what that movement has been historically and what it might look like in the future. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to just email them to me. It's chelsea@leveldi.com, and I'll share those with the speakers and see if we can get some responses for you. So thank you again, and a huge thank you to Tonia, Kay, and Amanda for your time today.
Thank you. Loved it.
Thanks. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone.